Hello, my name is John Grossman, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. And I'd like to welcome you to the 6th session of our fall webinar series, titled Wisconsin's Fire Towers, 1911 to the present day. Our speaker tonight is Ricky Kubicek. He is the Cultural Resource Coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He's worked as a professional archaeologist for nigh on 20 years. His work has taken him from the Czech Republic to Ireland, throughout the Midwest, to all corners of Wisconsin. He's also a member of the Board of Directors for the Forest History Association of Wisconsin and enjoys the opportunity to dust off his UW-Stevens Point issued history degree in the service of developing the story of Wisconsin's conservation history. As I now hand off to our presenter, please consider a couple of issues to aid the success of this session. First, note questions you may have for the presenter during the presentation, and then take time to pose them via the chat feature in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. If you're new to Zoom and have challenges navigating the system, you can also pose a question to get help from the facilitator using that same feature. And finally, please be aware that tomorrow you will receive a follow-up email from Zoom with a link to an evaluation form on a SurveyMonkey. Please reflect on tonight's presentation and take time to complete the form for us. Following the advice that all of life really is connected across the miles and years, you can help us better connect by offering productive feedback and keeping our connection to the public we serve healthy and up to date. Now, along with you, we look forward to this evening's presentation.
All right, thanks, John. Let me share my screen here.
Looks good, Ricky.
All right. Thanks to those who've decided to tune into this presentation. Myself and the Forest History Association of Wisconsin very much appreciate your interest. Also, happy Fire Prevention Week. That's right, October 4th through 10th is Fire Prevention Week. This year's focus is on safe cooking. The safest way to cook is to order out, I say. Plus, it supports local restaurants who need your help. I started researching fire towers about a year ago, so I'm relatively new to the subject. And I grew up in southeastern Wisconsin, so unless you are lucky enough to be from Slinger, the one place in the entire region with a tower, you didn't have much exposure. Oh wait, here's a map of the 20-minute walk it took me to get out to Little Switzerland from my childhood home in Slinger, so perhaps I was lucky. I never climbed the tower myself, though I did mountain bike around the base of it and down the ski slopes, which was a blast. I recall daydreaming about being up in the cab, protecting the village from fires or robots or dinosaurs or whatever else a kid can imagine. I was just one of the 2,500 citizens of Slinger in the 1980s with some affinity for the tower, and I'm sure many others have personal stories as well. Now, multiply that by all the towers in small towns across the Northwoods, and you'll get an idea of the enthusiasm folks have for these tall places. In researching fire towers, I came to appreciate the entangled nature of the history of these structures. That is, the towers arose to address the specific need of forest fire suppression. That may be seen as the primary thread in the web of their history, but what caused that need? The prevalence of fires in the late 19th and early 20th century is its own complex story. Another thread to chase is, who built the towers? Well, most were built by the state of Wisconsin during a time when the state government apparatus was becoming increasingly organized, standardized, and bureaucratic. The development of state government, in particular, the bureaucratization of early conservation efforts, is a large part of the web as well. National politics and socioeconomic factors also contribute to the understanding of observation towers. Without the ready source of labor provided by economic depression and the political climate that allowed for the New Deal alphabet soup programs, there would certainly have been a delay in implementing the effective fire prevention network that came about in the 1930s. There are also competing technological developments that have an effect on tower development and, ultimately, decommissioning. The rise of aerial recon in 1915 wasn't quite ready to compete with towers. Then, in the 1930s, became a complementary tool whose trajectory eventually came to supplant the primacy of towers as spotting tools. Technology, economics, politics, personal history, and contingency or chance also play a role in the discussion as relates to this single class of material structures. Reconstructing that entangled web is the fun part of history. And that leads me to an overview of our discussion today. There's a ton of ground to cover, and I'm only going to address a small and what I think is fun part of the topic. To start, I'll cover the immediate historical antecedents that set the stage for implementing lookout towers within a fire prevention network. That's the story of why fire lookout towers were needed in the first place, how they were employed, and some of the results of their use. There's the story of the folks who operated the towers. There's a general psychological and romantic curiosity for souls who crave the solitary life. The fact that the tower life either attracted folks who know how to write or turned non-writers into such through a necessity to do something doesn't hurt, as there are numerous memoirs of smoke watchers available, from modern classics like Philip Connor's Fire Season to Warren Yar's Smoke Chaser. There's also a corpus of anecdotes available in the fantastic Wisconsin Conservation Bulletins, published from 1936 through 1975. Source material that I've used for this presentation has been entirely based on documents. I'm aware that a ton of folks are still kicking around who actually worked on the towers in Wisconsin. It's regretful in the current situation that we can't meet and mingle, but that leaves ample room for more research and recording. I know that our friends at the Wisconsin Historical Society have expressed an interest for me in recording these oral histories. So if you or someone you know has tower stories to share, drop me a line. Finally, for me, there's the story of the towers as anachronism in a modern world. The wordsmiths over at Oxford define an anachronism as a thing belonging or appropriate to a period other than that in which it exists, especially a thing that is conspicuously old-fashioned. As structures built to fulfill a particular function, fire observation towers, I would argue, fit that bill. Those that remain on the landscape may have had their function adapted to something else, but we know what they were originally intended for. Many have been repurposed to take advantage of their exceptional novelty and unparalleled views as rooms for rent. Others have been adopted into the ever-expanding communications networks, sold to private individuals for reconstruction, or simply decommissioned, their materials being reworked for different means altogether. And a few have been preserved as historical monuments, available to view and appreciate in as close to their original form as possible. They remain emblems of a time, place, and story. These are the things I'll be covering over the next half hour or so you know how you'll be spending your time. We won't get into architectural history if that's your passion, though I found some neat resources to share if you'd like to further explore that avenue. I also won't get much into the mechanics of fire spotting itself. The use of alidade, triangulation, and phones and radios are relatively simple concepts. The perceived need for fire towers in northern Wisconsin is based on the history of the landscape. And taking the long view, that would be the relatively recent history post-European contact. Prior to European incursion in the area that would become Wisconsin, forest cover was estimated at between 60 to almost 90%. Among the host of traumatic changes precipitated from the exertion of Western culture was the likely irrevocable change to the old-growth forest. As Europeans pushed in, the surrounding forest was exploited in different ways depending on environmental factors. Timber use was very different in the South than in the North, mainly due to the suitability for agriculture. With some exceptions, timber was not a major economic factor in the South, as most of the forests were chopped down and burned to provide room and fertilizer for agricultural development. The rise of the timber industry in northern Wisconsin followed the Civil War and expanded quickly thereafter. By the 1890s, the state was a global leader in timber production with over 3.5 billion, with a B, board feet produced per year, along with 211,000 cords of pulpwood used. To understand the scale of the harvest, a federal survey of Wisconsin's forest estimated the total red and white pine volume in the 1850s at 130 billion board feet. By the turn of the century, only 17 billion board feet was estimated to remain, with a few billion board feet being harvested per year. The survey's author, E.B. Furneaux, describes the scene. In almost every town in this region, logging has been carried on, and 8 million of the 17 million acres of forests are cut over. Lands largely burned over and waste brush lands, and 1/2 of it as nearly desert as it can become in the climate of Wisconsin. Elsewhere, Furneaux insinuated a need for forest management thusly.
Some ignorant people, ignorant both as to the requirements of the wood industries and as to the condition and character of our forest resources, have claimed that the natural growth of young trees, without any attention, following the operations of the lumbermen, would suffice to replace that which is removed and would continue to furnish the required material. Culling the valuable kinds and leaving the inferior tree weeds in possession of the soil prevents in many cases any reproduction of the valuable species.
He further laments that in cases where valuable species do make a slow reappearance, they are generally killed by fire. In the annual report of the State Forester of Wisconsin from 1908, E.M. Griffith gives a great description of how the early timber harvest methods spurred massive fires. It should be noted that Griffith was a savvy character, and he was presenting the below argument to the state in response to some recent large-scale fires across the Northwoods. Griffith describes the scene. It is a matter of common knowledge among lumbermen that only a portion of the once magnificent forests of northern Wisconsin was ever utilized, and not to exceed 40% of the timber ever reached the sawmills. I myself, not being a lumberman, was educated by this statement. Lacking context, 40% efficiency seems pretty low. He continues, this was due to the fact that in the early logging operations, only the choicest trees were cut, and forest fires, fed by the highly inflammable pine slash, which was not disposed of in any way, were so fierce that nearly all the remaining trees were destroyed. The cutover presented a host of problems for forest management, but the most dramatic may have been the prevalence of fire. The way that timber was harvested at the time left copious amounts of slash on the landscape. This byproduct of the harvest consists of tops of trees, large and small limbs, and trees broken or cut down which are too small to be sawed up into logs or used for any other project. The material readily ignites and contributed to the intensity of forest fires. Forest fire prevalence and intensity has varied through time, and it should be noted that large-scale forest fires did occur before the cutover, but the Euro-American logging industry in Wisconsin queued up forests for burning like never before. The frequent and rampant blazes within the Northwoods created a problem that needed addressing on a variety of fronts. Like a medical treatment that addresses the symptoms, people attacked the forest fire problem by trying to fix the conditions that led to their intensity and ability to get started. Griffith pushed for legislation mandating the cleanup of slash as a way of addressing one of the underlying causes of the problem in 1908. Though these met with resistance in the legislature, it wasn't until 1931 that state regulations governing slash best management practices were established. Another tactic proposed was to appoint officials as fire wardens to watch for fires and enforce prevention ordinances. In 1905, 249 town fire warden posts were created. Building on this, Griffith proposed organizing a capable force of patrols and rangers to spot and fight fires in their nascent phases, as well as improving fire prevention infrastructure. He also pushed for expanding the telephone system to increase response time. The infrastructure needed to control fires consisted of communication systems, fire lanes, fuel breaks, and fire towers. In 1911, Wisconsin appointed 12 forest rangers and 11 special fire wardens who focused on improving this vital network, including placement of fire observation towers on the landscape. These folks got to work immediately. By the following year, they could claim credit for 59 miles of new road, 100 miles of fire lanes, 56 miles of telephone cable connecting 4 ranger stations, and 4 brand new 55-foot tall metal fire observation towers, along with 4 auxiliary towers for emergency use. Special mention should be given to a national first for the state of Wisconsin. On August 2nd, 1915, Jack Velas piloted and Ellis Weaver was spotter for the first airplane smoke spotter mission. The novelty and perceived efficacy of this method was described by the 1915 American Forestry Journal as such.
Quite the latest development in the protection of the forest from fires is the appointment of an aviator to detect any forest fires near Big Trout Lake in Wisconsin. He is J.A. Vilas, a relative of the late United States Senator William F. Vilas of Wisconsin. Using his hydro-aeroplane and arising from Big Trout Lake, Mr. Vilas in a few minutes can reach an altitude of 1,000 feet, and from that height can survey some 200,000 acres of forested land. If he detects smoke indicating a fire in the forest, he can report in a few minutes more to the state forestry headquarters for the district, and in a very short space of time, state forest rangers can be placed along the line of the fire. Regarding the value of these missions with respect to fire towers, the author continues. The use of a flying machine is particularly valuable for this kind of work where the country is flat or where there are no high elevations upon which lookout stations may be placed. In flat or rolling lands, lookout towers enable the observer to guard a territory of rather small area, whereas Aviator Vilas, at the height of 1,000 feet, can detect a fire 30 or 40 miles away from the lake.
Interesting stuff. And this mission gave Wisconsin fire detection a lot of publicity at the time. What it did not do was prove very effective at providing smoke observation, especially in comparison to the development of lookout towers. While aerial reconnaissance would eventually be a factor in the retirement of lookout towers, these missions were shelved shortly thereafter due to a lack of surface-to-air communication and an inability to use them during the most dangerous periods, those being on windy days. For the foreseeable future, fire towers and phone lines would be viewed as the best way to develop smoke spotting infrastructure. Indeed, in 1920, 4 more observation towers were constructed in Douglas and Bayfield counties, along with phone lines connecting them with Drummond and Brule. The following year saw 3 more towers built, extending detection to Pattison State Park and Brule State Forest. This pattern would continue. By the end of 1927, as the Wisconsin legislature reorganized a new conservation department that would eventually become the DNR, the network of fire protection had expanded to include 400 miles of phone line and 54 lookout towers. One of the missions of the government's new creation was, to quote the 1927 statute that created the Wisconsin Conservation Commission and Conservation Department, and I quote, to establish and maintain an efficient firefighting system for the protection of forests. This mission was born out of an increasing commitment by the state legislature to fund fire prevention and to put state citizens to work in light of increased economic stresses caused by the Great Depression. In the year before Franklin Roosevelt created the CCC, the Wisconsin legislature appropriated $500,000 to forest protection programs that directly resulted in over 1,000 miles of new and improved roads, 190 miles of phone lines, 342 miles of fire breaks, large-scale slash cleanup along the transportation corridors, the construction of 21 new fire lookout towers, and the replacement or relocation of 20 of the older model towers. In short order, the federal government would follow suit in putting an unemployed populace to work in order to address both economic and environmental problems. The heyday of fire prevention infrastructure development occurred after 1933, the year the Civilian Conservation Corps was founded. Due to a combination of increased political attention to conservation and a ready labor supply from the Corps, and to a lesser extent, the Works Progress Administration and Emergency Conservation Work programs. These federal programs, combined with the already increased trajectory of fire suppression attention, dramatically reduced the total number and acreage of fires across the landscape. By the end of the 1930s, the number of observation towers was at 110. There were 590 miles of phone cable connecting ranger districts, towers, and other important locales, a highly organized network of firefighters, the employment of chartered aircraft for smoke detecting, and by 1938, the use of two-way radio technology as a communication device. This takes us about to the time the US entered World War II in 1941. At this point in time, the fire prevention network and the place of observation towers within that network stabilized fire control in the Northwoods, though we will briefly touch on some of the changes brought about by World War II. From this point forward, the relative pace of innovation and legislation would become more incremental, with increases in radio technology, optics, cartography, and machinery advancing communication ability and firefighting prowess on the line. We'll leave this sketch of how fire towers became established in Wisconsin to focus in a bit more on fire observation towers themselves. Winding back the clock a bit, it's unknown precisely when fire lookout towers first started to be used, but in the United States, the federal government began using tree stands and high point tents in the early 1900s. These developed into more formalized structures in the 1910s with the construction of cabins and other more permanent structures on high landscape spots. The iconic Air Motor Company observation tower was introduced in 1914, representing a pretty major update over the ad hoc tree stand style. In terms of the historical development of fire observation towers in Wisconsin, there is one major development that requires discussion. As the rest of fire prevention infrastructure began to catch up to the perceived needs of fire suppression in the 1930s, so too did tower design and engineering. This was precipitated by a tragic accident that occurred in 1931, when high winds leveled the Ada Lookout Tower in Forest County, killing the lookout on staff. An engineering investigation determined that the tower was both inadequately designed and that it was constructed in error. The primary determination of the engineering study was that the old tower style, being adapted from windmill specs, was inadequate to support wind pressure on the enclosed cab. As one would expect, this resulted in compulsory examination of similar towers throughout the state, all of which failed inspection. The results of this inspection led to the recognition that the WCD needed a permanent engineering division. The new division's first job? Design and supervise the installation of new and safe towers throughout the state. The Wisconsin Standard Fire Tower was born from this effort. Tower improvements included the first ladder guards to protect the lookout during climbing, concrete footings, and better map stands and alidades. Within the design's first year, in 1932, 22 new Wisconsin Standard towers were erected, and 20 of the old towers were completely reconstructed to meet specifications. The towers themselves were mostly prefabricated by the Air Motor Company in Chicago, then shipped to WCD shops in Wisconsin for construction. Production and replacement continued through the decade, culminating in 1939 with 31 new Wisconsin Standard towers built at the Tomahawk shop. In 1938, the Forest Service Division of Engineering published a manual on standard fire tower design. The manual is interesting in that it promotes both the importance of the utilitarian type as well as a more recreational or public-facing aesthetic for prospective locations on prominent landscape features or in locales easily accessible by the public. If you're into the nuts and bolts of towers and lots of engineer drawings, this is a freely accessible document. In terms of overall design trajectory, early towers were mostly made of wood, with metal towers coming to play after about 1910 or so. Wooden design towers were never fully replaced, but tended to be used more for auxiliary towers later on. As metal towers gained more traction, the design specs were improved from the ad hoc windmill styles with cabs to sturdy prefab units manufactured by one of a couple tower production companies, including Air Motor and International Derrick, among others. I'm sure there are many for whom the technical aspects of fire tower engineering is a fascinating study. I'm not one of those, so I'll refer you to the aforementioned manual and proceed to discuss aspects of the people involved in the fire suppression process, focusing on those in the lookout system. There are three primary positions involved in the identification process of fire prevention: the lookout, the dispatcher, and the ranger. To simplify, the lookout identifies smokes by observation, then calls the dispatcher. The dispatcher confirms the coordinates of the smoke and decides whether or not to send a ranger or sometimes fire warden out to investigate. The ranger, having received information about the smoke from dispatch, generally will take a small crew out to investigate, then will radio back to dispatch with an update and requests for additional resources or that the problem has been solved. I'll expand on the process below, focusing on the lookout and the ranger and neglecting the poor dispatcher. First, I'd like to present a brief ode to the lonely lookout who served watch in the towers, high above the tree line. As you might guess, the solitude of the lookout lifestyle has led to a well-developed corpus of smoke watcher poetry. Forest Ranger Roy Kelly from Wasaki, Wisconsin, took to Seussian poetry in describing the average day in the life with the following 1938 poem.
The towerman's job's a lonely one. He hasn't a chance to have much fun, sitting along and gazing about, awaiting the words, "It's time to check out." His lonely vigil he keeps on high, under the clouds, high up in the sky. When smoke he sees, dispatcher he phones, who always answers in very loud tones. "I've got a smoke on a certain degree." "How far away from?" says he. Then he checks with another tower, and rangers are there within the hour. Sometimes he bakes and sometimes freezes, has no jurisdiction o'er the breezes. Week in and week out he sits and sways, and every week has 7 long days. Now some may think it's a wonderful snap to stand all day and lean on a map, but they too would be ready to shout when they heard the words, "It's time to check out."
Something about the lookout life must breed prose. Philip Connors, who wrote the most recent great American novel about the lifestyle of the last of the lookouts, noted that literary heavyweights such as Jack Kerouac, poet Gary Schneider, Edward Abbey, and Norman Maclean all spent time in the towers. So, besides perhaps a touch of the literary spirit, what qualifies one for the life of lookout? Connors, summing up the above-mentioned writer's remembrance, lists the following characteristics that are beneficial for the observer. Not blind, deaf, or mute, must be able to see fires, hear the radio, respond when called, capable of extreme patience while waiting for smokes, 1 good arm to cut wood, 2 good legs for hiking to a remote post, ability to keep oneself amused, tolerance for living in proximity to rodents, a touch of pyromania, though only of the non-participatory variety. District Forest Ranger F.M. Burke was perhaps a bit more politic in listing faithfulness, constant vigilance, good judgment, knowledge of the country, and ability to take instructions. Besides the wit and fun displayed by Ranger Kelly's 1938 poem, I think it's pretty instructive of what the life must be like. During the 7 to 9 months of the average Wisconsin lookout season, there were always long periods of waiting and clock watching, sandwiched around short bursts of excitement. Dispatch seemingly always had a job for the watch to do. Typical jobs might include fighting small fires, road repair, telephone line repair, conducting information and instructions to other forestry workers from the station, leading tours and answering questions from the public, checking burn permits, stocking fish, and taking forest health surveys. They were also in charge of maintenance on the towers and grounds where they worked, including general maintenance on the towers. This includes checking bolts and nuts, cab cleaning, window washing, and clearing the grounds around the tower and adjacent structures. Painting had to be done at regular intervals using prescribed colors, gray for the floors and light green for the wall so as to reduce glare. I think the best appreciation of the tower observer's life can be gleaned from their daily logbooks. These are an invaluable resource for a variety of topics centered, of course, on conservation history and fire suppression, but also important for understanding the daily life of people in general throughout the life of the towers. In addition to fantastic detail regarding smoke and conservation work, we get additional tidbits on how major historical trends affected the average citizen. For example, and you can see on the slide here, a liner note from September 1st, 1939 that reads, "Poland invades Germany." At least I think that's what it says. I don't think that's what actually happened, but interesting nonetheless. Now I want to present a rather lengthy journal entry that describes one tower observer's day handling a potentially dangerous fire. If you so wish, you may want to close your eyes and picture yourself in the cab of the tower overlooking the Northwoods. For authenticity's sake, put yourself in brown khaki pants and green button-up shirt. This is from Ranger F.M. Burke's panegyric to the Tower Watchman from 1940.
October 8th, 1940. 9:10 a.m. Reported on duty. Wind southwest 4 to 7 miles per hour. Visibility 8 to 10 miles. Condition of telephone, good. Heavy dew has been staying on grass until around 9 o'clock in the morning during the past 2 weeks. The leaves are all off the trees and grass and ferns are all dead. Saw quite a few ducks flying around lately. 10:45 a.m. Wind is increasing considerably, now blowing 13 to 18 miles per hour. Reported this to Ranger Station and was advised by dispatcher that reading on wind speed recording gauge was 16 miles per hour. 11:10 a.m. Small white smoke sighted on reading 254 about 12 miles away. Seems to be down around the Black Slough somewhere according to that location with respect to the 3 big pines on Norway Point. Reported this to the station immediately. 11:15 a.m. Smoke on 254 spreading rapidly and billowing into a very heavy white cloud. Looks like she's going places. Reported this to station. Dispatcher advised me that crew of 20 men had been sent out along with a tractor and plow unit. 11:25 a.m. Smoke has spread out over a degree in length now. Wind seems to be getting stronger. Gave station another report on this. Was advised that another crew of 25 men had been sent out to fire. 11:50 a.m. Smoke on fire on 254 has now stretched out along entire western horizon. Impossible to take readings on front of smoke column anymore due to the high wind. 2:05 p.m. Wind shifting to west. Smoke from fire on 254 blowing in on tower. Can't see anything. Don't see why it is necessary to stay up here, but the dispatcher says to stay right here. I'll be here. 4:55 p.m. Wind has shifted to southwest again and has died down some, now blowing about 8 to 12 miles per hour. Fire on 254 still going strong. Dispatcher advised me that all of the Black Slough Marsh had been burned and that the fire was spreading through the highland area to the north. He told me that the ranger estimated over 500 acres burned over already and that the fire had started from a campfire close to a duck hunter's blind along the northeast shore of the Black Sloughs. 5:40 p.m. The big fire seems to have died down considerably. Quite a little smoke there yet, but doesn't seem to be running. The dispatcher informed me that the fire was pretty well under control and that fire control lines had been practically completed around the edge of it. He said that I would have to stay up for a while and keep my radio turned on standby in case the communication between the fire and the Oak Ridge Tower failed. 6:25 p.m. Getting pretty dark. Can see some flames showing up on the big fire yet. Dispatcher informed me that I can go down now. He said that the fire was under complete control and was burning only on the inside at many spots. Left the tower at this time.
Okay, you can open your eyes. And here's a taste of a decidedly different day. You can follow along with this one on the slide or head back into your imaginary tower.
June 14th, 1940. 8 a.m. reported on duty. Wind southwest 14 miles per hour, visibility 12 to 15 miles, condition of telephone good. First day on tower since May 15th. Have been working at station and on maintenance of fire lanes, gates, and fire equipment and 100 other things. A fellow certainly has to know a lot of different kinds of stuff on this job. Had a couple of Sundays off, which was somewhat unusual for a towerman anyway. 10:30 a.m. Party of tourists climbed the tower. One woman climbed up only halfway and got sick. This was much better than if she had climbed up here and got sick. Two of the other women made it up all right. Yes, boy, did they ever ask me questions. Here are some of them. Now that we're up here, how are we going to get down? Why don't you have an elevator in this outfit? How high are we anyway? How long do you have to stay on the tower? Do you have to stay up here all night? How do you get a job like this? Do you ever get lonesome? How many towers are there like this? How long do we have to wait here to see a fire? What is this outfit for? Can we smoke here? Do you have a match? Do you ever see any deer around here? What do you do when it rains? Who cooks your meals for you? Do you follow this work because you like it, or do you have asthma or something? What do you do in case of lightning? Does anyone ever fall off the tower? Aren't you afraid the tower will blow over? I suppose they give you your vacation during the winter. And how? They finally left about noon. 5 p.m. Wind southwest 13 miles per hour. Visibility 10 to 12 miles. Condition of telephone good. 6 p.m. Checked off duty. No smoke sighted at all today.
For all the romance involved with this most solitary of professions, the observer was, by necessity, connected to a network of fire control professionals and had a very serious job that demanded attention in the face of long periods of boredom. The following excerpt is from the biennial report of the State Conservation Commission and describes the expectations placed upon towermen working in the Woodruff area.
The following instructions apply to each towerman. Continuous observation between the hours 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. is absolutely necessary during such weather as requires lookout duty, and all watchmen are required to be at their stations between the above-mentioned hours. As soon as a fire is located, call headquarters and get in communication with the ranger nearest the fire. If the fire is outside the district of any ranger, then call any person having a telephone within the fire zone and request him to get to the fire as soon as possible and to notify the nearest fire warden or ranger. Every effort should be made to obtain the cooperation of settlers, resort owners, and other persons who can be helpful in the territory covered by the lookout. Each morning before leaving the ranger station, call headquarters camp to see if the line is in good order, and after getting to the tower, call headquarters to be sure the line is in good working order, and if the line is out of order, repair it immediately. You should submit a report on the weekly report blanks to E.M. Weaver, Head Ranger, Woodruff, Wisconsin. When weather conditions are such that it becomes unnecessary to be on the lookout for fires, you will receive instructions from Head Ranger Weaver regarding your further duties.
Well said. One of the lighter, unofficial duties of the Tower Observer was public relations and education of visitors. I've read in several sources about the huge number of visitors who would stop by towers during the fire season. Perhaps the long periods of solitude made fire lookouts extremely willing to chat. And who else would know better about the ins and outs of a landscape than they? These friendly contacts in the wilderness are something that will be missed. Lookouts did their job in all manner of challenging weather. Towerman Warner Radke, observer at Saddle Mound Tower near Prey in Jackson County, reports on a particularly harrowing experience. He states,
On the morning of May 29th, I was awakened by the growl of thunder. There was a storm approaching Saddle Mound country from the west.
Did Mr. Radke pack it in at this point? Not a chance. Continuing,
I proceeded to do my morning's work as usual. The storm came rapidly, with a ferocity like I never witnessed before.
quite the sense of duty. Then it gets real.
It was almost 7:30 when the storm closed in with all its fury. Lightning flashed and thunder roared. Then there came silence, which seemed to say, "What's coming next?" And without warning, there was an awful crash, which seemed to raise the foundation of the tower cabin out from under my feet. For a minute or so, I could not realize what had happened. At first, I felt sort of numb. It seemed as if the gods of the elements were trying to do evil. Then I realized that lightning had struck either the tower or the tower cabin. The The damage was slight. The things I picked up from the floor were myself, the telephone, and a broken alarm clock. I sincerely hope that no other towerman ever has the same experience, for it is most unpleasant.
Mr. Radke was not to have his wish. Moving out west to one of the giants of modern literature, author of the famous book A River Runs Through It and Other Stories, Norman Maclean writes in the short story, U.S. Forest Service, 1919, The Ranger, the Cook, and a Hole in the Sky.
In the late afternoon, of course, the mountains meant all business for the lookouts. The big winds were veering from the valleys toward the peaks, and smoke from little fires that had been secretly burning for several days might show up for the first time. New fires sprang out of thunder before it sounded. By 3:30 or 4, the lightning would be flexing itself on the distant ridges like a fancy prize fighter, skipping sideways, ducking, showing off but not hitting anything. But 4:30 or 5, it was another game. You could feel the difference in the air that had become hard to breathe. The lightning now came walking into you, delivering short, smashing punches.
It should, of course, be noted that towermen were supposed to be ordered down during electrical storms for safeties, although that was not always possible. Many folks wonder how a tower person does their job in a landscape that has many benign reasons for the appearance of smoke. This question was posed to Ranger Bob Doyle in 1937. The answer is interesting in illuminating the preparation and forethought required for the job, as well as peculiarities of an earlier time. A citizen, identified as L.R. from Beloit, posed the following question to Ranger Doyle. The thing that has always puzzled me is how the men in the tower can tell whether a smoke is the beginning of a forest fire or merely the smoke from a distant house or train or village. Ranger Doyle's answer.
The tower men soon learn to recognize what is known as a permanent smoke from a dwelling, village, or the engine of a small sawmill. The coal smoke from a train is black, and the men know the schedules of trains which travel within the visibility of their towers. When a new towerman calls the dispatcher at the ranger station, much concerned about a black smoke that keeps changing its position, the dispatch usually explains that it is a train. This is one reason for the fire permit system, which requires a farmer who intends to burn brush to get a permit, giving the location of his brush piles. The dispatch then places a pin in his district map at the place where the brush fire is to be built.
The effectiveness of lookout towers was well documented. A report by Rhinelander District Ranger Joseph Donahue in 1953 deserves an in-depth look. Ranger Donahue was the boss of these folks manning the observation towers, so his words carry weight. The ranger states that lookout towers in his district reported 2,103 smokes in 1952, known to be a year with bad fire conditions, but a good fire record. For context, the Rhinelander district, known as District 8, covered 1.25 million acres. Based on Donahue's statistics, fire tower spotters accounted for 60% of detection reports in the district. This was supplemented by the methods which would eventually phase out the need for towers, those being citizen monitoring and aerial recon. Donahue supplies other interesting stats regarding suppression efficacy. In 1952, his district had 92 fires. The total response time for all fires, from reporting to complete suppression, was 63.5 hours, or 42 minutes per fire. The overall time begins with reporting from the lookout tower to the ranger station, followed by dictation of instruction and location to the firefighting crew, corralling equipment and staff, travel time to the fire location, and the time it takes to suppress the fire. Pretty impressive stuff. No wonder Mr. Donahue was proud of his district. Of his team, Donahue states,
When someone says to me, "You guys have been pretty lucky with fires during this dry spell," it stirs me rather uncomfortably. Maybe there is such a thing as luck, but I am not counting on it to solve the fire control problem in this district for me. I am counting on the endeavors of my men to bring us through a fire season successfully in District 8. I am sure there are 9 other district forest rangers throughout Wisconsin who feel the same way. Success in forest fire control does not come easy, nor is it born on the wings of Lady Luck. It comes from building and operating a complete fire prevention, regulation, preparation, detection, and finally suppression procedures. It comes from soliciting, developing, and getting wholehearted public cooperation and support.
The work of the forest rangers in this network deserves its own recognition. I can think of none better than that offered by H.T.J. Kramer in his Ode to the Wisconsin Forest Ranger, published in the June 1937 issue of the Wisconsin Conservation Bulletin. This describes what rangers do while not engaged in fire suppression. This excerpt is heavily condensed to focus on fire suppression, as Kramer was both thorough and exquisitely florid in describing a ranger's work. He trains and drills firefighters, tries out equipment. He climbs hill after hill to find a location for a new tower that will cover a heretofore blind area. But it is during the fire season that the efforts of our rangers reach their peak. Hours? The ranger knows no hours. He feels responsible 24 hours a day, and he will put in 24 hours a day at firefighting if the situation demands it. Rangers have gone without sleep for 48 hours and longer. In a bad fire season, the ranger's office resembles a telephone exchange. Towers are calling and are called back. Crews are called out. Fire bosses report. The telephone rings incessantly. The U.S. Forest Service was no different than most other sectors of society in the early 20th century in perpetuating the compartmentalization of labor into fair and course-based work based on sex. Women were almost universally excluded from the Forest Service until World War II. The first female U.S. Forest Service field technician and longtime fire lookout, Hallie M. Daggett, hired in 1913, is the exception that proves the rule. The American Forestry Journal of 1914 reports of her appointment as fire lookout.
Some of the servicemen predicted that after a few days of life on the peak, she would telephone that she was frightened by the loneliness and the danger. But she was full of pluck and high spirit, and she grew more and more in love with the work. Even when the telephone wires were broken, and when for a long time she was cut off from communication with the world below, she did not lose heart. She not only filled the place with all the skill which a trained man could have shown, but she desires to be reappointed when the fire season opens this year.
The fact that this was a novelty and that the measuring stick of effectiveness was a type male demonstrates the gender values of the time. Like many other industries, it took World War II to make clear to men in forestry, only via necessity, that women are equally effective in the field. For example, it wasn't until the U.S. entered World War II in 1941 that women were appointed to work in fire towers by the Wisconsin Conservation Department. Marie Barlow of Crivitz, Wisconsin, took over at the Thunder Mountain Observation Tower in 1943, filling in for the previous towerman who went into the service. Barlow wrote a brief article about her experience in the WCB of that same year. The article was instructive in that it had nothing to do with gender outside of the first sentence that stated, "Many women have taken jobs as towermen in the fire towers to temporarily replace men who have gone into service." Over the next couple pages, she proceeds to give a succinct report of duty and process, the same as any other I've read. Like most other sectors of society, there was some immediate regression in workforce equality following World War II, for a variety of factors, followed by a slow but steady improvement that continues to this day. As an aside to this, I'd like to note that the reconfiguring of conservation work and forest protection in 1942 and 1943 was fascinating to read about. The shuttering of the CCC and WPA, combined with the war effort and draft, completely overhauled the distribution and availability of labor. Reading about how open folks were to admitting the problem, and how folks work together to come up with solutions was a source of optimism for me as we face an unprecedented change in labor practices now. While there was a backslide after World War II, the lessons learned were not forgotten and were used in subsequent generations to advance the cause of equality. At one point in time, the primacy of fire towers within the fire suppression system seemed unassailable. The institution was so well developed and efficient that it must last forever. Forest Rangers J. Peterson and R. Pripps certainly felt that way in 1941, writing,
There is no question about the permanency of the lookout system. It has definitely proved to be the most efficient and economical method of securing early discovery and instituting prompt action on forest fires. Air patrol is still more or less in a primitive stage, although it is used extensively in certain areas by other fire control agencies. In Wisconsin, it appears that air patrol can only be used to supplement and not replace lookout towers for detection work.
the lesson here, besides don't write in absolutes because a pedantic historian will invariably use it to support a counter-argument, is this. It is extremely hard to predict the trajectory of both technological innovation and politics. I mention politics because budgetary considerations are usually cited in these types of decision. One of the laws of nature is that metal eventually fails. After 75 years exposed to the elements, structural evaluation showed that rehab and replacement of existing towers was a widespread necessity, which would cost upwards of $25 million. Budgetary restraints, along with responsible governance, necessitated a hard examination of the best use of taxpayer funds. Continuing to support a network whose efficacy has been overshadowed by more cost-effective methods was deemed no longer tenable. In terms of technology, aerial recon has certainly increased over the years, but the real breakthrough has to be in citizen-based monitoring assisted with immensely powerful computers with real-time GPS units in most people's pockets. Without the ready access to mobile phones, it's likely that some fire towers would still be useful in Wisconsin. At one time or another, DNR and the U.S. Forest Service staffed around 119 towers throughout Wisconsin. By 2014, the DNR had reduced the number of staffed towers to 60, and those were only manned during periods of high wind in the spring. In 2015, the department followed the example of many other natural resource and conservation agencies across the United States and decided to decommission the remaining 93 still standing towers. Taking the place of the lonesome lookouts would be an increase in aerial recon, high-tech meteorological equipment, and, most importantly, citizen monitoring. The decision to retire the towers both acquiesced to technological advancement and was seen as providing budgetary relief during a period of constrained departmental funding. Of the 93 towers that were still on the Wisconsin landscape in 2015, 11 were on DNR land. The remaining towers were on lands owned by U.S. Forest Service, other public entities such as cities and towns, private individuals, and private companies. As of last year, 37 property owners terminated their land easements without dismantling the towers. The map shown here depicts the status of the divestment process of all towers with DNR interest. You'll notice several different categories, but not likely the one of most interest, that being standing towers. As the majority of the towers are located on private land, DNR has respected the privacy of landowners and not published their names and disposition toward their own property. The decision of what to do with towers divested to a private owner lies solely with the landowner. Further complicating the story is that those towers that were deconstructed may have been purchased and rebuilt on other private land. I'll discuss a couple of the interesting tower cases below. First, Grantsburg. The case of the Grantsburg Tower shows that those slated for demolition may have a second life. Steve Briggs, a contributing writer for the Burnett County Sentinel, got the scoop on this story. The Grantsburg Tower was built by Wisconsin in 1951 and was staffed until 2011. Briggs interviewed Doreen Schneider, a spotter who worked at the tower for 24 years for this story. Schneider, along with other enthusiasts, hoped the tower could be saved. Well, luckily, the tower was purchased by John Dobbs, a retiree from the Minocqua area. Mr. Dobbs has been a longtime tower enthusiast and, working with a friend in the construction trade, managed to dismantle the tower and reconstruct it on the highest hill of his Montreal acreage in Wisconsin. The Gordon Tower is listed as conveyed on the map. The ultimate disposition of this tower made state and national news. Chelsea Lewis of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel reported the interesting story of timely meetings, community organization, and state agency cooperation that ultimately led to the Friends of the Bird Sanctuary, a local nonprofit friends group affiliated with the nearby Douglas County Wildlife Management Area, to acquire the tower and the immediate surrounding property. The final goal of the group is to rent the tower and a cabin located at its base to travelers via some outfit like Airbnb. This would both preserve the tower in place, promote the friends group's birding activities, and create another recreational draw for Gordon, Wisconsin. Like most best laid plans for the year 2020, progress on getting the property open has been delayed due to COVID response. At this point, there are 2 lookout towers in the state that are on the National Register of Historic Places. These towers will be preserved for the public to view and appreciate in as close to their original form as possible. The internal stairs mountain tower can even be climbed by those so willing. The 100-foot tall mountain lookout tower is a prefabricated Air Motor Company LS-40 model galvanized steel structure manufactured in 1932. It was originally erected by the Wisconsin Conservation Department about 2.5 miles east of its present location in the Nicolet National Forest. In 1935, the Mountain CCC camp disassembled the tower and rebuilt it at its present location 2 miles north of Mountain in Oconto County in order to put it closer and to increase accessibility. The mountain site has ruins of the former tower's attendants' living area, located about 350 feet north of the tower proper. The ruins include pits, depressions, and foundations of the cabin, woodshed, a garage, well, privy, and garage pits. The site was staffed by members of the Mountain CCC F-19 camp from 1935 to 1941, and thereafter by U.S. Forest Service staff. The last call at the tower was placed on April 15, 1970. After that, the tower was decommissioned in favor of local aerial recon. The site is currently maintained as an interactive interpretive center with interactive signs and open access to the cab. The tower was last used in the fire prevention networks in the 70s. Since then, it's been repaired twice, in 1994 and in 2015 and 16. The 100-foot tall Fifield Lookout Tower is a galvanized steel prefabricated Wisconsin standard ladder protected model. It is located 5 miles east of Fifield in Price County, Wisconsin. The nearby ruins of the attendant's cabin and garage are located to the southeast and west respectively. The tower was also built by the WCD in 1932 and was likely prefabricated by Air Motor, though documents confirming this have not been identified. The Wisconsin Standard Ladder Protected model is characterized by the exterior ladder with circular cage surround. This creates the tube that we saw Mr. Loadwagon climbing up in earlier slides. You and I cannot climb up this one. U.S. Forest Service took the bottom 20 feet off the ladder in 1973 to comply with safety standards. Furthermore, the wooden floor of the cab is somewhat deteriorated, so you may not want to hang up there anyway. The Forest Service has done a good job with interpretation of this site, installing panels and completing an oral history project recording stories of 2 early lookouts, the brother and sister Manny Stein and Betty Murnick. Due to Fire Observation Tower's conspicuous placement on the landscape, wonderful views, and novelty, for those not employed in fire suppression, these towers have been a draw to the general public for a variety of reasons throughout the years. If you have stories, please feel free to send them to me via email. One of the earlier interesting stories I found was from George Ruger Jr., serving at Ashland County's Butternut Fire Observation Tower in 1936. Ruger recalls that his tower was a local destination for honeymooners, stating, "Many are the brides and bridegrooms who stop at the tower 1 mile north of Butternut on Highway 13 to view the world from the top." I will not venture further on what types of views those folks took in from on high, but Ruger's logbook shows that the visitors from each of Wisconsin's 71 counties had stopped by for a visit. On the other end of the spectrum, towers were also used as part of school children's education. In the 1930s, the Wisconsin legislature mandated a conservation curriculum for schools. Part of this was fulfilled by field trips. It's almost unbelievable in this day and age, but teachers and children used to climb the towers to get hands-on experience. This undoubtedly had an impact on career choices, either pro or con, for many children. As the time and place for fire observation towers has passed in Wisconsin and throughout most of the rest of the U.S., folks are looking to preserve or use towers in different ways. While this might not preserve the historic integrity of the building, see the Frankenstein Tower without the attached communication devices here, for instance, they at least keep them on the land. So far, the most prevalent use has been telecommunications easements on the towers. Another growing trend is repurposing certain tower types as lodging, either as cabins or rental rooms. Now, the cabin movement is for lower profile wood structures present in hilly areas, so isn't really an option in northern Wisconsin. The camping option, as discussed for the Gordon Tower, though, is certainly a possibility. And who knows how private land users will continue to reconstruct and repurpose the towers as time goes on. Well, that's all I have for today, so I want to thank you all for your time and for listening to me today.
Thanks, Ricky. I am Tom Giroux. I'm going to be moderating the Q&A here. So were any towers ever destroyed by fire? Whoops, hold on, my chat went away briefly.
All right.
Any of the towers ever destroyed by fires? Did any of the observers ever perish on the job? And you talked a little bit about the lightning.
Yeah, so we got the case at Otta in the early 1930s of a tower being blown over in a high wind because the cab was too big for the old windmill designs. And there are, if you just do a Google search for lightning strikes, I think everybody who ever worked up on the tower that has a lightning strike has told that story in print at some time, and they're really fantastic to read. I haven't heard of any towers burning down, but I'm sure it had to happen somewhere. That's why the prescriptions and the daily task lists for a lot of these area ranger stations for the tower workers was to clear out brush from the immediate surrounding areas every morning. If there was any tree fall or slash around it, they had to get that far away from both their residences and the towers.
That's part of being fire-wise, I guess, is to make
Right.
sure all your structures are free of various things that are could catch fire in fire-prone areas.
Mm-hmm.
So just waiting for a few more questions. You folks out there should have some, I would think. Lots of positive comments about the presentation, Ricky.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting the opportunity to sit down with people in real life that actually worked on the towers and taking some notes, you know, maybe having a beverage and talking about their experience, because it really is one that people that haven't been involved in the conservation industry or fire suppression just seem to have a genuine interest for. So hopefully when this is all through, we can get together and chat, maybe at next year's annual meeting or something like that.
Did the fire towermen actually work 7 days a week?
So the actual need for fire towermen to work those extreme hours was completely dependent on environmental conditions and the amount of backup laborers that they might have in that area. So you know, if it's a dry midsummer windy conditions, then they have to have someone up there all the time to keep that network complete. But if it's the rainy season, I've read other logbooks where they climb up every 15 minutes or so to get the weather or to log in, and then they climb down and do other stuff. There are conflicting accounts of being able to read books and play guitars up there. Some people say that was absolutely verboten, and other people certainly did it. So, you know, it runs the gamut.
So a comment here from one of our retired rangers. Towermen were very competitive. No one wanted a tower farther away to see their smoke before they did. And I think there was, that helped build observation, you know, because it had to be hard to concentrate all that time, all day long on the landscape. It must have gotten very monotonous.
Oh, absolutely. I've read that too. And you know how competitive people are. If your job is throwing rocks, someone's going to want to throw a rock the farthest. So obviously for fire towers, you're going to want to see who can spot it first. And I've also read that there's also good natured razzing if you call in a train or something else instead of a fire. But people took that seriously as well.
Did the fire watchers always live near the fire tower?
In Wisconsin, a lot of the fire towers are located in relative proximity to towns, so that wasn't always a necessity, but some of them that are in more of the wild areas definitely have cabins on site. And so I think for Mountain and Fifield, those are both National Register sites, so they're really well documented. In the National Register of Historic Preservation places nomination forms for both of those are available for the public to read, and they provide a great overview of the history. But both of those have living quarters that were on site that have been demolished, but there is the depressions there that you could still explore, and it would be open for future archaeological excavation if ever that was of interest to the Forest Service.
Does the DNR have plans to maintain any standing towers for interpretive, educational, or historical purposes?
I can't comment specifically on that at this time because the process is still going on, but that might be something depending on the particularities of a certain project that the department would be open for, but I can't speak for forestry.
Okay, did other states have fire towers like Wisconsin did, or did other states meet their fire challenges in other ways?
So a lot of the states, I believe the engineer's name was Lemke in 1931, had engineers that redesigned those towers at about those times. And again, we're working with probably about 5 or 6 companies that supplied the prefab for the CCC boys. And those are almost identical. If you go through the list on the register online of Wisconsin's fire towers, most of them look pretty much identical. At least the metal ones with the cab on top, and then the 4 legs. So yeah, they're pretty much standardized. The ones, if you go out west, you get a lot more variability in areas that already have high points. So some of those earlier ones are architecturally significant themselves. If they were designed of wood or stone, some of them look castle-like, and they're really cool to look at.
So another comment from our ranger, retired. The real productive aspect of towers was in ensuring the regulations of open burning via the permit system. And there is evidence that Wisconsin is now losing control of open burning, and we'll see what that brings us in the future.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That's something else I read that I wasn't aware of, was that the tower men actually checked the permit right away. When they saw the smoke, they could reference that in coordination with the dispatch. They'd know instantly whether or not someone was in compliance or not. So that's a really good point.
Do you know anything about the Squirrel Hill Tower outside of Minocqua?
I could find out, or I could, if you could email me about it, I could look into it. But offhand, I know it existed, but I don't know where it is in the process right now.
Okay, and to move over to the Q&A to get a couple questions here. Lots of more comments. Winter Park in Minocqua is working to preserve that Squirrel Hill Fire Tower. And would enjoy talking to you about that in the future. For people who want to contact Ricky, you can just email me. You'll get the follow-up email or follow-up email tomorrow, and I'll have my email address, and I'll forward it on to Ricky.
Sure. You can also look my name up. It'll come up on the state websites as well.
How exactly is aerial recon conducted?
So that's something that's changing, and we'd want to get a forester in here to talk exactly how that's being conducted right now. But if I put on my future hat, one could envision unmanned aircraft being something that would be employed, and I know it's employed in some places. I'm not sure if the department is using that technology right now, or satellite even technology could be used to recognize patterns perhaps even faster than human eyes could, which is interesting. I don't want to rule out anything in terms of technology. And I think they also have high point installed cameras that they have that can recognize smokes as well.
I am just checking to make sure I got everybody, and I think I did. So Mr. Grossman, you can come back on and thank Ricky for his presentation. I thought it was wonderful. I really enjoyed the stories and the audio. It was really interesting.
Absolutely. I think the script you used would be an outstanding read beyond the presentation you offered us. Really great job, truly. You reminded us as Fire Prevention Week. And,
yes, it is.
Next Thursday, October 8th, is the 149th anniversary of the Peshtigo fire. Fire Prevention Week centers on the Peshtigo fire and the Chicago fire, which occurred at that time 149 years ago. It might be a prompt to those of us on the board to think about the 150th anniversary coming up.
That's right, John. My wife, who read some of the presentation, her grandparents were survivors of the Peshtigo fire, so got a little lineage to that one.
Wow. Yeah, that's
jumped in the river.
Absolutely. To close this out, you know, I hope those of you online will take time to offer us feedback. Be aware that this and all of our presentations have been recorded, and the recorded version will be posted to YouTube, and you'll find a link at our website ultimately to go back and look at it. If you want to listen to this one again, or refer someone to the program you may have enjoyed that they could take another look at. They won't be able to ask questions at that point, but if they have questions, we can get a hold of us. There's a design at our website to reach out to us at any time to pose a question that we'll route to someone to get you an answer. So thank you one and all for taking the time to join us on this effort. Thank you in advance for any feedback you can offer us on how we can improve to better serve your interests and needs. Know that part of our goal is a focused outreach to K-12 educational systems in Wisconsin. We're trying to work more closely with the school forest system to tell the story of Wisconsin's forest history. The contention is that management of forest ecosystems is tied to decision-making, they say, at a range of scales, both temporal and spatial, time and space. Our interest is that time thing, the story that crosses generations. Without further ado, thank you so much. And I think it's time to close this out and move on. Tomorrow's presentation is on, this is tomorrow's presentation, sorry. Next week, it's Hemlock on October 20th. So hopefully some of you will have interest in that and join us then. Thanks and good night.
Thanks.